Okay, we're going to start a lesson on the energy flow through an ecosystem. We're going to start with a question, why do we eat? One of our 8 characteristics of living things should help us answer that question. That characteristic was all living things must obtain and use materials and energy. So if we look at that statement, why do we eat then? We eat because we need materials to build with. Those materials being the elements found on Earth, which we put together into molecules. Those molecules that are used in living things to build things like our organelles and our cell membranes and all that fun stuff. We also use those same materials then sometimes to produce energy to power our living organisms. And that's kind of what we're doing when we eat. We eat to get the materials and the energy. If you remember back to 9th grade science, they taught us a relationship between materials, energy, and the earth, and they simply stated it as they are neither created nor destroyed. What was here. They may change forms, but they're not destroyed. In a biological sense or an ecosystem sense, materials follow that same rule. They are constantly being recycled, and they are never really being destroyed or being removed from the earth. They are following that same physical science rule. Energy in biology, however, is a little bit different. Energy seems to flow, and flows in one direction only, and there is a definite ending to that. So energy flows in one direction and runs out. It's constantly being used and decreases with each transfer. Again, we're going to talk about that transfer piece here in a second, but with each transfer, each time we transfer energy in a system, it seems to be decreasing. So what does that mean for us? That means that it has to be constantly being added. So where would that come from? What is adding that energy to our systems? Well, we can guess in one word. The answer should be the sun, right? The sun provides us with the solar energy that our living organisms on Earth are going to transfer into the chemical energy that our cells are going to be able to use to provide that cellular energy, which we're going to call ATP. So the sun's going to be a very important part. It is the one that's going to constantly be adding energy to our ecosystems, and that's what helps us with this problem here. Now, in a physical science sense, energy then is just simply changing shape along the way. In a biological sense, it looks like it's in one direction and runs out. So you'll see that these two seem to go hand in hand, however, are acting differently. So we see the materials being recycled or follow a flow in a circle, whereas energy seems to be aligned, but they seem to be matched up pretty well. This diagram that you see here is showing that relationship. Let's first take a look at it from the material standpoint. The materials are up here. It says abiotic chemicals, the non-living chemicals, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, minerals. We could throw in things like hydrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Those are the materials that all living things are being built from. Some of those things we actually learned about in our biochemistry unit in biology. That's where it starts for the materials side. Now they're going to be taken in by some organisms on Earth that we're going to call the producers, and we're going to get to the definition of producers next, but those producers are the ones that are able to take those abiotic chemicals and combine them together to form what we're going to use as food along our ecosystems. So as you can see from the diagram, you'll see that the producers that have a couple routes it could take. It could be eaten, or it could die and then be eaten by the decomposers, or they could be eaten by something called consumers. Again, we'll get into the specifics of those here shortly. In either case, they're going to follow this circle, and eventually the decomposers, which are going to break things back down into small pieces, are going to get them back down into the abiotic chemicals again. So it's this circle that it's following. It just keeps getting recycled and recycled and recycled. Energy, however, isn't like that. And you'll see a couple things of energy on here. One being the sun up here, and this is where it all starts, the solar energy. Now, the producers have the ability to take that solar energy and create some molecules that we're going to use to power our cells. Those molecules are going to be molecules of sugar. So the plants are able to do that and start the forward motion of this energy to what seems to be the end over here at the decomposers. So here's our producers. They take in the solar energy and they're going to create the sugar. Now they're going to get eaten. Okay, they're going to get eaten by the consumers. And as they eat, you'll see this word heat here. What that's symbolizing is that it's symbolizing that it's an incomplete transfer of the energy. What it's showing is that there's some energy that's lost. This is a loss of energy. And in fact, that a good majority of the energy that was taken in by the plants is going to be lost in this transfer. So we actually lose 90% of the energy in this transfer between producers and consumers, and then consumers within consumers. So we have animals that have eaten the plants. They're going to get about 10% of that original energy that came from the sun and the producers. When those animals that are eaten by other animals, they're going to lose 90%. So they're only going to gain overall a 1% of that original solar energy. So we can see it starting to diminish again and again and again. Now they die, and it's going to be transferred, and we're going to lose some more as heat. Again, 90% is the rule. Eventually, the decomposers are going to end up with very little of that original solar energy, and they're going to use it all up. So when their last transfer heat goes up, it's going to bring it down to just about zero, and so we're going to say the energy is going to stop here. So now the decomposers have broken the materials back down into its smallest pieces. It's also going to use up the last of the energy at this point right here. Again, here's the sun. As long as the sun's shining, this input of energy is always going to be here, and it's going to keep flowing forward. So we can see the flow of energy seems to go from the sun to the decomposers and ends. The flow of materials starts the chemicals and goes through the cycle and ends up back in the chemicals again as the producers take up those materials as they grow. So we've mentioned a couple different terms here. We've mentioned producers and consumers and decomposers. We're not going to touch back on the abiotic chemicals. That's going to be in a different lesson. But we are going to touch on producers and consumers at this point. We want to ask the question, what are producers? Okay, what are the producers? Let's go ahead and get this on the page a little bit better. So here's our producers. What are producers? Producers are going to be organisms that create their own food. Now I tend to use create because I don't want to say make. I make my own food too. I'm in the kitchen, I'm making my food. It seems like I would be a producer then. However, what the producers do differently than what I do is they use photosynthesis. Now the question is, they use photosynthesis to do what? If you answered convert, let's see if I can get this on the screen, convert, I can convert the sun into what? They're going to convert the sun into sugar, which is going to be used to power our cells. Okay, so at this point in time, that's what we're looking at. So the producers are going to create their own food using photosynthesis, and that photosynthesis actually converts the sun or the solar energy into sugar. That's what we talked about on the last screen. So how are they different than the consumers? The consumers, let's put this on here right here. What are consumers then? Consumers then are the ones that have to eat those producers, right? They have to eat something for their energy source or their food source. So again, they're going to be they're not going to be able to use the sun. So if they don't use the sun, which means that they do not use photosynthesis, what do they use instead? They're going to be using respiration. Yes, let's not try that. Let's try this. Should be answering respiration. Here's respiration. So respiration, as we know, is the process where we're converting that sugar that was created in photosynthesis to the cellular energy called ATP. Now, what are some examples, might you ask? Some examples of producers. Let's go ahead and take some ideas at this point in time. You might say that maybe an apple tree would be an example of a producer. How is that a producer? Again, it is an organism that uses the sun to do photosynthesis, to combine the materials taken from the earth and from the air, and making it into the plant that we see today. It's also taking the sun and converting it to sugar so that we can use that as our food source down the chain. You could also maybe say that grass would be a producer. That would be correct as well. Or maybe the dandelion. Yes, the dandelion is a producer. Although you would ask many homeowners right now that they would be a real nuisance of a producer, but it is a producer nonetheless. What about some consumers? What would be some examples of consumers? Okay. Now, before we can give some examples, we better talk about what types of consumers are there. Not all consumers are going to be the same in terms of what they eat, but remember, they all are going to eat something. The idea of being a consumer is going to be that it consumes or eats. So they are going to be classified by what they do eat. So, for instance, we have a type of consumer called an herbivore. And many of you remember this from 9th grade or 7th grade science. An ivor means something that's eating something else, and then herb meaning plants. So it is going to be a consumer that eats just plant life or just the producers. So we'll have things like rabbits, okay, maybe some form of bison. We'll have things like our grasshoppers and cows and horses, and those kind of organisms are going to fit into the herbivore category. Now, those are going to be just eating plants. Now, there's organisms on Earth that they just eat animals. Okay, we're going to call them carnivores. So we'd be talking about things like the fox, or maybe the tiger, or maybe something cool like the polar bear. Huh? Cool, polar bear. Or maybe a bird of prey like one of the eagles, or a hawk, or an owl. So there's a lot of those carnivores they're just going to eat other animals. They're going to eat herbivores, they're going to eat omnivores, but they're not going to go back and be able to eat the plants. Now, what about the ones that are in between? Okay, omnivores. Omni means all, so they're going to eat both plants and they're going to both have the ability to eat animals. So if you take a look at some examples of omnivores, you might go a raccoon. A raccoon will eat either one. Or maybe a brown bear. A brown bear will eat either one. The picture I don't have right now, but is very much on your screen right now, is going to be a human. The humans are going to be omnivores. We eat both plants and animals. Now, there's one other type of consumer that we talk about. We're going to call that a decomposer. And decomposers are going to break down the dead stuff, right? So the dying things on Earth are going to be decomposed, and the most common decomposer is going to be some kind of bacteria, but we could definitely throw in things like mushrooms into that category as well, or the fungus in general are going to be decomposers. They're going to feed only off dead things. Now, it could be dead plants, could be dead animals. They're not going to be choosy. They're going to break it back down, use up the energy, and break it back down into its smallest components, which we call the elements, or the molecules, or the what they call that in the back of that one screen, the abiotic chemicals, the non-living chemicals. So those are the type of consumers and some examples for those consumers. That brings us to the end of this part. It'll be continuing on part 2, so look for that video next.